Just wait some seconds.
Hello, I think we are already screening. So hello, good afternoon. It's with the greatest pleasure I welcome Professor Michael Anesko to our second international conference on Henry James. The conference is supported and organized by the Núcleo de Estudos Henry James, or in English, the Henry James Study Group, Brazil's first, and I think the only one for now, Jamesian research group. I am Marcelo Pen, and I am professor at the University of São Paulo, and I have been studying James for some years now, since the 90s from last century when I started my graduate course. And so Michael Anesko, Professor Michael Anesko is, I think, and I'm sure, one of today's greatest experts in Henry James, with an MA from Penn State University and a PhD from Harvard University. He's professor of English and American Studies at Penn State University. He's one of the editors of the first scholarly edition of James' work, The Complete Fiction of Henry James, being currently published by Cambridge University Press, and co-editor with Greg Zacharias of The Complete Letters of Henry James, a project embraced by the University of Nebraska Press. In 2016, he curated an exhibition at Harvard Houghton Library, marking the 100th anniversary of Henry James' death. It all means we are here very greatly in debt to Michael. I've been following him since my master's studies, when I read his, for me, seminal book, Friction with the Market, Henry James and the Profession of Authorship, where he challenged the idea of Henry James as being this writer trapped in the ivory tower of art and oblivious to the hustle and bustle of the marketplace. Among his other works, and there are many, I just selected a few, are Generous Mistakes, Incidents of Error in Henry James and Queer Filiation, Hardened Bachelors of the Edwardian Era, and Henry James Framed, Material Representations of the Master, which was published last year. Outside the Jamesian studies, Anesko has published The French Face of Nathaniel Hawthorne, Monsieur d'Aubépine, and his Second Empire Critics, and The Torments of Spring, Jake Barnes' Phantom Limb, In the Sun Also Rises. I finally met Michael in the beginning of this year when I went to State College, the city where he was born, for a bit of research at Penn State. During our delightful conversations, I proposed he gave a talk in our conference, an invitation he so generously accepted. I just hope next year, or not next year, next time, because the conference is every 2 years, in fact, next time we can bring him in person to Brazil. So I give you now Michael Anesko, Professor Michael Anesko, who will present his paper, The Absence of Personal Loyalty, Service, and Disservice in Henry James Brooksmith.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, for that very gracious introduction. I just want the audience to be aware that when you hear me say the word slide from time to time, that's simply a direction for our technical assistant to advance some pictures I want you to see as we move forward. So is the initial slide visible to everyone?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay.
Oh,
yeah. Okay, there we are. Okay. Okay, you can move to the next one then, slide. When most of us come across a reference to James's intriguing biographical study of Hawthorne, we probably recur in memory to the infamous enumeration of the items of high civilization, which James felt were, as he said, absent from the texture of American life. The list hardly bears repeating, if only because most of you probably know it by heart, or at least I would bet the latter half of it, which gets so comically specific. Slide. No great universities, James lamented, nor public schools. Of course, not a bad line for a Harvard dropout. Indeed, it's easy to forget that James begins his notorious catalog in social and specifically political terms, observing, for example, that in Hawthorne's day, the United States of America could barely lay claim to a specific national name, let alone display the imposing manifestations of nationhood as Europeans commonly understood them. Henry Adams, we recall, slide, felt exactly the same way as he struck his Gibbon-like pose, contemplating the unraised pillars scattered around the still unfinished Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and wondering when, if ever, a recognizable and powerful state would come into existence. America had neither a standing army nor an established church, and certainly no monarch to oversee them, which is how James's long list of cultural negatives starts off. Slide. No sovereign, as James put it, no court, no personal loyalty. For the purposes of my talk today, I want to focus on this particular item from James's list, his mention of personal loyalty, and I want to make audible some of its resonances in the master's life and work. Of course, even to refer to James as the master, as we habitually do, already presumes that a rather peculiar form of personal loyalty continues to exist between the writer and his audience. And what more obvious form could it take than our proceedings this afternoon? If James were here, he did, after all, anticipate the immortality of consciousness. It's not difficult to imagine that he might be rather overwhelmed by the sheer volume of academic praise routinely heaped upon him. But I also suspect that privately, he would be hugely gratified by any and all signs of true devotion. After all, personal loyalty was very high on his list of civilized qualities. The biographical evidence to support such a claim is both widespread, I think, and sometimes wickedly funny. That is, when it is not also sometimes perhaps a little pathetic. Readers of his letters surely know that James excelled in the art of condescension, but that did not prevent a faithful congregation of admirers, devotees, protégés, and acolytes from surrounding him, especially in his later years. And we know that James guarded their attention quite jealously. When H.G. Wells, for example, slide, rudely broke out of the charmed circle by publishing his superficial parody Boon in 1915, the sting was quite profound. His vast paragraph, Sweat and Struggle, Wells jabbed, they could not sweat and elbow and struggle more if God himself was the processional meaning to which they sought to come. And all for tales of nothingness. It is Leviathan retrieving pebbles. It is a magnificent but painful hippopotamus, resolved at any cost, even at the cost of its dignity, upon picking up a pea, which has got into a corner of his den. Of course, almost all the rest, including people like Percy Lubbock, Theodore Bosanquet, Howard Sturgis, Edith Wharton, just to name the most familiar, these people were loyal to the end, and then some. For most of his life, though, James's needs for polite deference were also attended to by other, much less visible and less articulate people. Like most other members of his privileged social class, James relied upon the labor of domestic servants on virtually every day of his adult life. Slide. Even in his earliest bachelor quarters in Piccadilly, his weekly rent, which was not much more than $12, included provision for meals and household service, And it was through these simple arrangements that James was truly initiated into the customs of a social life in which demarcations of class were more strictly observed than they were in America. The delirious days of dining out 107 times in one London season were still ahead of him. For now, at least, society was represented by the circle of James's immediate household and a small list of literary acquaintances. In his letters home, James wrote with touches of humor that were intended to magnify the grandeur of his really quite modest situation. But even here, one senses that his style effortlessly becomes a strategic tool for defending bourgeois priorities. "I have an excellent lodging in this excellent quarter," he proudly confided to his sister Alice, "a lodging whose dusky charms, including a housemaid with a fuliginous complexion, but a divine expression and the voice of a duchess, are too numerous to repeat. I have just risen from my first breakfast of occasional tea, eggs, bacon, and the exquisite English loaf, and you may imagine the voluptuous glow in which such a repast has left me. Chez moi, I am really well off." Well, the housemaid has a fuliginous complexion, begrimed by soot, that is. James's voluptuous glow, on the other hand, largely depends upon her labor. Another significant compensation of her service, apparently, is the maid's voice, by which James euphemistically refers to her pronunciation, like that of a duchess, a trait that further conceals and presumably dignifies her menial status. Also present in the household, James went on to say, was a young woman whose only job, it seemed, was to answer the front door. She wasn't really a servant, James observed, but rather a dependent relative of the landlady. "She's what they call in England a person," he noted. "She isn't a lady and she isn't a woman. She's a person," which meant, of course, that she was a kind of non-person, a nobody. The power of class to subvert or erase the literal meaning of language sometimes brought James to the brink of absurdity. When a new servant girl appeared with his breakfast one day, even a fuliginous complexion did not prevent her predecessor from quitting her job to marry a deformed cobbler, he added. James naturally asked her what her name was. "Well, sir, it might be Maria," she hesitantly replied. "It might be?" "Well, sir, they calls me Maria." "Isn't it your name?" "My name's Annie, sir, but Mrs. says that's too familiar." So James called her Annie Maria instead. In the letter home in which the novelist recorded this odd bit of dialogue, again, perhaps to show the folks back in Cambridge just how well he could transcribe Cockney speech, James also offered a more telling social comment. "It is part of the British Code," he explained, "that you can call a servant any name you like." Without batting an eye, James added, "Many people have a fixed name for their butler, which all the successive occupants of the place are obliged to assume, so that the family needn't change its habits." In light of this fact, it is almost amusing that the butler and cook who had the longest tenure with James himself were a couple named Smith, which is about as close to anonymity as you can get. Slide. James first acquired a staff of personal servants when he left his rooms in Bolton Street in favor of a much more spacious apartment in Kensington. "My man and wife are excellent," he reported to his Aunt Kate, "and the woman even a better cook than I require, as I dine out so much." To this sometimes parsimonious relative, he particularly wanted to point out the delicious economy of his new scheme. "They are on board wages," he continued. "That is, I pay the two $50 a month, out of which they find all their own food, washing, beer, etc. They do for me altogether, and I don't have to give an order or worry about anything." Not more than a year later, however, James would refer to the couple as a pair of, as he said, sad sticks, even while conceding that they were perfect domestics. Unlike the as yet to be imagined Brooksmith, these Smiths were seemingly devoid of imagination. "My excellent but wooden-faced cook has just presented herself as usual," James reported to his brother, "with a large, clean, white, respectful apron, to ask for the orders of the day. It is at these moments that I feel the want of assistance, especially as the lady in question is so reverent that she never presumes to suggest. On the other hand, she and her spouse buy everything for me. I never have to go to a shop, and don't cheat me. They are on board wages, that is, have to provide their own food. And every bone that leaves my table comes back with a persistency that makes me say, "Is your master a dog that you should treat him thus?" Well, as I trust it should now be apparent, by the time that James lamented the absence of personal loyalty in America, its traditional function in Britain was being disrupted by the encroachments of a market-oriented economy and culture. Serviceability and immediate convenience were displacing a different, more vulnerable kind of reciprocity in the scale of social value. As a normative ideal for structuring relations between members of different classes, the customary expression of personal loyalty was implicitly reciprocal, though obviously paternalistic. The medium of exchange and empowerment in such a relation was not merely pecuniary, but also sentimental. Slide. A point nostalgically made week after week by such long-running television series as Upstairs, Downstairs, or more recently, Downton Abbey. The possession of capital was, in this sense, an anterior prerequisite for personal loyalty, a condition for its coming into being, rather than a necessary determinant of everyday practice. As a sign of modernization, however, and the rationalization, so-called, of economic life, traditional forms of service came more and more to resemble the ordinary wage relations between capital and labor. The troubling instability of this shift affected James's life and art, in personal as well as professional spheres. James registered the consequences of an impending absence of personal loyalty, a relation that could not survive in the modern world of ubiquitous contract. Slide. James takes up this theme most directly in a touching short story called Brooksmith, which was first published in Harper's Weekly and the British illustrated newspaper Black and White in 1891. The idea for the tale came to James 7 years prior to this, however, for in June of 1884, he recorded the germ of it in his notebooks. Indeed, as we shall see, the intervening years had a significant impact upon the shaping of this curious little tale, for as market forces came to exert considerable pressure on James as a professional author, straining his own sense of personal loyalty to his publishers, so too do these forces insinuate themselves into the story of a sadly displaced servant. Slide. It could be argued that Brooksmith is less a story than a kind of obituary, much like Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener, which it, I think, uncannily resembles. Slide. The tale gets its title from the story's nominal protagonist, a butler in service to a distinguished retired diplomat, Mr. Oliver Offord, slide, whose name is both a pun and a cynical play on words, since it rhymes with both its homonym, the generous past tense form offered, and slantwise with the more conditionally qualitative infinitive, afford. In a Dickens novel, Offord would probably be the metonymic name of a butler, not his master. But in James's ironic reversal, the best that Mr. Offord can afford, his guests, is the company of his butler, whose instincts for sociability radically transcend his menial station. How was it, the anonymous narrator questions as he reminisces, that we were never a crowd, never either too many or too few, always the right people with the right people? There must really have been no wrong people at all, always coming and going, never sticking fast nor overstaying, yet never popping in or out with an indecorous familiarity. How was it that we all sat where we wanted, and moved when we wanted, and met whom we wanted, and escaped whom we wanted, joining, according to the accident of inclination, the general circle, or falling in with a single talker on a convenient sofa? Slide. Slide. Okay, yeah. Why were all the sofas so convenient, the accidents so happy, the talkers so ready, the listeners so willing, the subjects presented to you in a rotation, as quickly foreordained as the courses at dinner. A dearth of topics would have been as unheard of as a lapse in the service. These speculations couldn't fail to lead me to the fundamental truth that Brooksmith had been somehow at the bottom of the mystery. If he had not established the salon, at least he had carried it on. Brooksmith, in short, was the artist. That particular distinction, however, is also Brooksmith's curse, for when Mr. Offord dies and his household is broken up, the artist butler finds himself bereft of his salon and his patron. Deprived of his station, Brooksmith finally must hire himself out, in the words of the narrator, as a mere waiter, engaged temporarily for the night, almost like a kind of servile prostitute. Like Stephen Crane's Maggie, he disappears from the story, a presumed suicide. The tale is not quite as sentimental, though, as this synopsis might suggest, largely because it is presented to us in the past tense and by a displaced first-person narrator. I have said that Brooksmith is the story's nominal protagonist because, like so many of James's mature short fictions, this tale also depends, for its effectiveness, on the strategic use of a central narrative consciousness, a voice other than Brooksmith's. We are scattered now, so the narrator begins, the friends of the late Mr. Oliver Offord, but whenever we chance to meet, I think we are conscious of a certain esoteric respect for each other. Yes, you too have been in Arcadia, we seem not too grumpily to allow. When I pass the house in Mansfield Street, I remember that Arcadia was there. This opening has almost the effect of etching a thick black border around each of the story's pages, as if James had composed it on Victorian mourning stationery. The story's mode of telling presupposes a kind of helplessness over its outcome, which serves both to intensify Brooksmith's little tragedy, but also to insulate the narrator from complicity in it. As the story unfolds, it soon becomes apparent that Brooksmith, not Mr. Oliver Offord, is the true subject of commemoration. The obituary, after all, is his. Inevitably, Offord's death precipitates Brooksmith's crisis. Slide. But this event also provokes the narrator, much like the American sociologist William Graham Sumner, to reflect upon the question of what exactly do social classes owe one another. It's all very well, the narrator asks to himself midway through the tale, but what will become of Brooksmith? His answer, far from satisfactory, foreshadows Brooksmith's sorry fate. No doubt Mr. Offord would provide for him, but what would he provide? That was the great point. He couldn't provide society, and society had become a necessity of Brooksmith's nature. At the same time, however, the narrator also works a clever reversal by insinuating himself as an object of sympathy. For if Brooksmith will suffer from the absence of society, the narrator confesses that he will suffer from the absence of Brooksmith. For the first time in the story, the narrator jeopardizes the class-bound security of his first-person plural form of address, the we that necessarily excludes Brooksmith, by admitting that, at least toward the end of Mr. Offord's days, it is for the butler's company that he knocks in Mansfield Street. But a genuine equality cannot be achieved, even when Brooksmith receives his guest, quote, at the familiar foot of the stairs. The servant remains standing while the narrator casually sits down. Significantly, James employs the language of the marketplace to aggravate this vexing problem of reciprocity. As the narrator describes him in these sorrowful days, Brooksmith had the solemnity of a person winding up under depressing circumstances, a long-established and celebrated business. He was a kind of social executor or liquidator, but his manner seemed to testify exclusively to the uncertainty of our future. I couldn't in those days have afforded it. I lived in 2 rooms in Jermyn Street and didn't keep a man. But even if my income had permitted, I shouldn't have ventured to say to Brooksmith, emulating Mr. Offord, "My dear fellow, I'll take you on." The whole tone of our intercourse was so much more an implication that it was I who should now want a lift. Indeed, there was a tacit assurance in Brooksmith's whole attitude that he would have me on his mind. The narrator's intrusive extenuation here deliberately confuses the issue of responsibility at the same time that it seals Brooksmith's fate. Ironically, then, Brooksmith's demise is graciously prepared for, and in keeping with his own high regard for decorum, the butler disappears from the story without so much as a whisper. When his executors disclose the terms of Offord's will, Brooksmith learns that his master thoughtfully has left him a legacy of £80. It was so like him to think of me, Brooksmith says, apparently without irony. But such a modest bequest cannot shield Brooksmith from the inexorable measure of the market, and it soon becomes evident that Offord's rare patronage has done his servant no special favors. In fact, a suspicion quickly spreads, and is confirmed, that the generous terms of his previous employment have, and this is the word that's used, they have spoiled Brooksmith. Among the former members of Offord's salon, a certain embarrassment, a sensible awkwardness attached to the idea of using him as a menial. They had met him so often in society. A slide. Poor Brooksmith, merely the first of the overqualified applicants. From time to time, as the months and then years go by, the narrator meets up with Brooksmith in different London drawing rooms, but a common shame overshadows any incipient feelings of sympathy, for both of them acutely sense how drastically reduced their social world has become. Slide. We had been in Arcadia together, the narrator inwardly moans, and we had both come to this, by which he means a particularly Philistine dinner party. The other guests at table required no depth of attention, the narrator confides. They were all referable to usual, irredeemable, inevitable types. It was the world of cheerful commonplace and conscious gentility and prosperous density, a full-fed, material, insular world, a world of hideous, florid plate and ponderous order and thin conversation. In the end, this indictment is rather self-serving, for the narrator, of course, has the privilege of declining such invitations, a reality that undermines his deceptive use of the first-person plural. It goes without saying that Brooksmith's options are foreclosed. In a literal sense, Brooksmith cannot serve this public because the public is incapable of appreciating his peculiar genius for service, which he has elevated to the realm of art. The story of Brooksmith, then, it seems to me, is a disguised variant of all those other Jamesian tales of writers and artists, parables of sow's ears and silk purses, which are tinged with the bitterness of autobiography, yet careful to avoid a compromised attitude of self-pity. In the difficult years between the first notation for this story, in 1884, and its composition in 1890-91, James, too, had watched his popularity suffer and his market shrink. He, too, had been, as it were, spoiled. As Frederick Macmillan was forced to point out, the novelist was rapidly becoming an expensive ornament on the publisher's list. Slide. Throughout the 1880s, James had pressed Macmillan to advance him hundreds of pounds on royalties that his books would never earn back. Finally, with The Tragic Muse, the publisher could no longer accommodate James's wishes. Looking back at a decade of declining sales, in 1890, Macmillan estimated the likely earnings of The Tragic Muse and offered James a 2/3 share in the profits, which he generously calculated to be not less than £70. Even Brooksmith with 80 did better than that, which is exactly the point. For at this precise juncture in his career, James was willing to abandon his own personal loyalty to Macmillan and cast his literary bread upon the waters. "I thank you for your note," James politely responded, "and the offer of £70. Don't, however, think my pretension monstrous if I say that, in spite of what you tell me of the poor success of my recent books, I still do desire to get a larger sum, and have determined to take what steps I can in this direction. These steps I know will carry me away from you, but it comes over me that it is after all better, even with a due and grateful recognition of the readiness you express to go on with me, unprofitable as I am. I say it is better because I had far rather that in those circumstances you should not go on with me. I would rather not be published at all than be published and not pay, other people at least. Slide. Farewell then, my dear Macmillan, with great respect, but with the sustaining cheer of all the links in the chain that remain still unbroken. Well, James's immediate experience with his publisher only reinforces the poignance, I think, of Brooksmith's fictional dilemma. The utility of his class in general is estimated by the foot and the inch, we are told, and poor Brooksmith had only about 5 feet 2 to put into circulation. Even in the New York edition, where, rather oddly, he grows by another inch, the diminutive Butler just doesn't measure up. Turned out of one place after another and forced to accept piecemeal employment, Brooksmith eventually begins to lose his extraordinary distinctiveness and to take on, as the narrator says, the glazed and expressionless mask of the British domestic. Unsympathetically now, the narrator attributes this sorry transformation to some failing in the butler himself. I said to myself that he had become a reactionary, gone over to the Philistines, thrown himself into religion, the religion of his place, and had joined the band of the white waistcoated who go out. There was something pathetic in this fact, and it was a terrible vulgarization of Brooksmith. Significantly, I think the narrator reverts to the language of the literary marketplace to describe Brooksmith's degradation. It was the mercenary prose of butlerhood. He had given up the struggle for the poetry. If reciprocity was what he had missed, where was the reciprocity now? Only in the bottoms of the wine glasses and the 5 shillings, or whatever they get, clapped into his hand by the permanent man. The rather chilling pronoun shift here into the third person, whatever they get, to me betrays the utter absence of reciprocity, and indeed, one might say, the absence of personal loyalty. Slide. What if just a few months before his death, Herman Melville had read this tale? Slide. Ah, Brooksmith, he might have sighed. Ah, humanity. Well, as I have tried to demonstrate, the narrative technique of this fascinating story gradually widens the social breach between the narrator and his increasingly pitiful subject. Necessarily, then, our access to Brooksmith's private thoughts about his dilemma also diminishes. In his notebooks, James's initial jottings about this tale might lead us to think that an anecdote about an unfortunate lady's maid, deprived of the genteel company and conversation of her mistress, gave the author his immediate inspiration for Brooksmith. But a different source might deepen our appreciation of the extent to which the story's class-bound anxiety was rooted in the author's personal experience. One first-hand witness, writing soon after James's death, offered this intriguing testimony about the master's ambivalent feelings about his adopted British home. I don't think he wanted to be in smart English society because he really preferred the company of smart people. It was rather that he did not like to feel that he was shut out from that or any other kind of company. He would tell me that he wanted to be taken seriously by the English. That was a phrase he often made use of. He told me once that he particularly detested that excluded feeling. I dare say also that he wanted to be enough in smart company to know what it was like. Well, that excluded feeling is precisely what pierces Brooksmith to the core. Trying to describe his bereavement to the narrator, the butler concedes, "Oh, sir, it's sad for you, very sad indeed, and for a great many gentlemen and ladies. That it is, sir. But for me, sir, it is, if I may say so, still graver even than that. It's just the loss of something that was everything. For me, sir," he went on with rising tears, "he was just all, if you know what I mean, sir. You have others, sir, I dare say. Not that I would have you understand me to speak of them as in any way tantamount. But you have the pleasures of society, sir, if it's only in talking about him. sir, as I dare say you do freely, for all his blessed memory has to fear from it, with gentlemen and ladies who have had the same honor. That's not for me, sir, and I have to keep my associations to myself. Mr. Offord was my society, and now I have no more. You go back to conversation, sir, after all, and I go back to my place, Brooksmith stammered, without exaggerated irony or dramatic bitterness, but with a flat, unstudied veracity and his hand on the knob of the street door. He turned it to let me out, and then he added, I just go downstairs, sir, again, and I stay there. Slide. This is a speech the narrator claims to have always remembered, but to paraphrase T.S. Eliot, I think he's had the experience, but missed the meaning. Brooksmith is a parable of social death, at the end of which the narrator simply muses with a shrug. He had indeed been spoiled. Slide. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much, Michael, for your illuminating talk. I invite the audience to forward questions to Michael, and I will try to translate them, but I must say I'm a very bad interpreter. So maybe with the help of Natasha. So yes, she's saying something, yeah, there.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really, really good. There were some things I was going to ask you, Michael, but I think you've already answered during the lecture. Let's see what Natasha says there. Can the absence of loyalty be... Oh, sorry.
We lost your second question. Oh, there it is. Oh, okay.
Yeah, can the absence of loyalty be extended somehow to the later works? And she's thinking of the Croy Merton Densher, Prince Amerigo, and Charlotte and Strater. They are characters from his late novels.
Well, that's a difficult question. The particular, I guess, angle that I was really interested in exploring here was really that between a more or less sort of patrician patron and his servants. I mean, interestingly, I think I did some other research about James himself. In his last will and testament, the servants who were still with him at that point, they each got £100. So they did a little better than Brooksmith in that regard.
Yes.
But, on the other hand, when he was, I don't want to say smirking, but, kind of suggesting in a sense how cheaply he could have service provided for him, I did a little math, that $50 a month that the Smiths as a couple would have received in the 1880s would mean today that they would have to live, to both of them, on an annual wage of under $20,000. So that's, rather startling to, to put it in that kind of relative frame of mind. But of course, then again, I'm sure, James also claimed to pay his servants well. And it's quite possible that maybe that was the prevailing wage, or maybe even better than the prevailing wage. I haven't been able to do enough, historical research in that way to know for sure. But it would be interesting to find out more, I think. But those other relations you're mentioning, Natasha, it would seem to me to put it into a different dimension, if you see what I mean, because it's not really an employer servant or worker relation, although to a certain extent Prince Amerigo might sort of stand in that relation.
I was thinking also, well, this question of the unreliable narrator and how it complicates or illuminates this portrait of the social classes and the social classes in England. And you talked a little bit about that. Maybe you could expand a little. And also that there's one thing about this story that for me is very interesting in Brazil, because it was one of the first stories by James that was translated.
Oh.
There were a couple or three others, maybe Washington Square before, but then we have Brooksmith in the 50s.
Huh.
And I was always wondered why
Well,
that particular story.
I could be rather crass and say maybe it's because it's one of the short ones.
Yes, that's a very short. Yeah, and the thing is also he deals with this subject of the classes, and this is a subject that he really rarely delves into overtly, at least.
Yes, right.
And I can think, for instance, in the same decade, In the Cage, perhaps there's a similar kind of, not the same thing, but the class question is there.
Well, there's really been very, very little scholarship about this story, in fact, over all the years. And for better or worse, the majority of people who have commented on the story, in a sense, seem to take the narrator's point of view for granted and assume that the story is, in fact, simply to be read as, in a sense, affirming the legitimacy of the class structure. That's not the way I see it at all, because I think if you read it more carefully, you can see the ways in which the narrator, in particular, retreats, from any sense of obligation, in a really, rather chilling way, especially that final, observation about the five shillings or whatever they get. It's just rather icy in its dismissal of anyone like Brooksmith, who of course has no choice but to put himself out for service in the terms that he's been reduced to.
Exactly. And also all his attempts to help the servant are really useless.
Right. I mean, I didn't go into that, in particular, but it's true that whatever suggestions he makes, they certainly don't amount to anything. But one also has to say he doesn't try very hard either.
No, and it's always this etiquette. Perhaps he says, "Oh, perhaps I shouldn't do that. Maybe he would be offended if I did that." And that's ridiculous. We see he would very much appreciate any help he could get, and he doesn't get any.
Yeah, no, it's a very poignant little story.
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Okay. And talking a little bit further on, you're thinking about developing this subject in James, this relation of lack of loyalty, this also the change of from a more ancient society, but more Arcadian society, and then to the marketplace and this other variants.
Well, I'm not sure that at this point in my career, I'm ready to launch into a whole new thing. But in some ways, this topic is almost an extension, at least, of some of the original concerns that I had with James, working all the way back to friction with the market and thinking about how the fiction itself may or may not have been influenced by the kinds of commercial or marketplace circumstances that James was finding himself in. And I mean, when I first discovered the information about saying farewell to Macmillan and his 70 pounds, it immediately brought this story to mind because the sums were so close.
Yes.
And, but I mean, another interesting thing about, you might say the aftermath of that story was that Macmillan eventually did give James a much higher sum of money, but only after James hired a literary agent to represent him and go back to Macmillan and lay down demands that, he finally acceded to. So in that sense, of course, James had a lot more leverage and power than someone like Brooksmith to reassert, his claims in the market. Brooksmith has none of that really. And in fact, seems to have been, in a way, made less hireable because he's become so sophisticated, because he is such an artist, because he is so well-versed in social manners and graces and, things that seem to somehow displace him from the expected status or the expected, kind of role. But no one can value it in the same way, or appreciate it. And of course, we know that James felt that way very much about his own work.
Yeah, this thing about the comparison to the artist, or that's very calls our attention immediately, and then reframes perhaps the way we were reading the story in this very particular sense. So yeah, I think you just got the subject that putting the James as the figure of James in a way complicating the structure of the classes as well, and that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I don't know, Natasha, do we have more questions from the audience? I can't see here. Oh, okay. Diana. Anesko, how does Brooksmith relates to the other Jamesian butlers? The outcry in the cage.
Boy, you're really testing my memory.
Yeah, mine too. I don't remember the other butlers.
There really aren't that many other characters who perform significant roles in James's other works, as far as I remember. I mean, In the Cage is, of course, a different thing altogether in the sense of the reversal of the gender, and but of course the parallel is there too, in which the in this case, of course, unnamed woman begins, or at least thinks she begins, to participate in the social lives of these customers who come and pass those telegrams back and forth over the counter. But I'm afraid to say it's been far too long in my reading history of the outcry to remember many of the details of that. Perhaps you could suggest some parallels yourself, Diana. Oh, okay. I'd have to go back and read that again.
I don't think he was a butler, but maybe he could be perceived as a person who does this kind of service. I'm not sure. I really don't remember now what he does in the story. Professor Gabriel asks, is it possible to relate the Jamesian interest for social loyalty between classes with his incursion by naturalism fiction in the mid-1880s?
Oh, I think there would definitely be a connection there. I mean, certainly the ways in which novels like The Bostonians, or certainly The Princess Casamassima, and even to a certain extent too, the Tragic Muse, are really trying to offer more of a kind of social panorama in the pages of the works than we typically find in certainly in James's earlier things, and in some ways perhaps even more so than the later works. I mean, you might remember Edith Wharton's rather curious remark about the golden bowl, about the characters just hanging in a void, as if there was no social world around them at all, which certainly is misplaced, I think, in certain ways. But in another sense, I mean, I think she was in a way measuring the distance that James had come from those denser social fictions of the sort of the naturalist period of the 80s and maybe the early 90s than what we find in some of the later works. I mean, probably if I were to think of a later work where one feels this perhaps more profoundly, it would have to be, I think, In the Wings of the Dove, curiously enough. I mean, Susan Stringham, of course, is not a butler, but on the other hand, she's very much in service to Millie Thiel, and the ways in which it becomes, of course, sadly obvious to us as we read that London English society as a whole has become rapacious and grasping. And to me, the most haunting line in the whole book is when Lord Mark turns to Millie and says, "No one here, you know, does anything for nothing." You know, that everything comes at a cost. Everything has its price. There is no such thing as, you know, disinterestedness or the kind of, quote, personal loyalty that is, of course, utterly opposed to that kind of predatory, you know, basis for social relations, which by 1902 seems to have overtaken the Edwardian world, at least as James represents it to us.
Yes, yes. I think we have another question just after Gabriel from Natasha as well. There is a suggestion that Brooksmith committed suicide for not being able to return to his previous conditions when he worked for Mrs. Offord. Can this be a trait of James' melodrama?
Well, the ending of the story is, of course, deliberately ambiguous. In some ways, and this was another reason why I wanted very much to at least hint at the curious analogy to Bartleby, because the narrator in Bartleby also feels obliged in a way to frame his death, frame the ending of the story in a way that is meant to arouse pity, but pity for him as much as for Bartleby. And the way that the ending of Brooksmith is framed by the narrator, I think, performs a similar kind of function. I mean, at the end, one of Brooksmith's relatives comes to reveal to the narrator that he's simply gone out, presumably to a job, and never come home, and no one knows what's happened to him. But the way the story trails off, the narrator seems in many ways to his narrative, his voice is almost overtaken by the Cockney speech of the relative who comes, until we get to the final line, when the class prerogative reasserts itself with that, Brooksmith indeed had been spoiled. It's a very curious twist almost at the end. I mean, the implication of suicide is certainly there, that he just has disappeared. But in a way, the narrator, feels obliged to think of him again as now in service to the gods on Olympus, and that he somehow redeemed himself by taking his, resuming his proper place in that kind of social order, which of course not incidentally seems to be a mirror of the British system. How else could paradise be imagined, right?
Yeah, in the afterlife only.
Yeah.
But I think also that Natasha is thinking about this traces, perhaps, of melodrama in Henry James. even in his most cerebral works, even like in the Masters. That's a thesis, I think, of Peter Brooks, perhaps, the melodramatic imagination. So what do you think about that?
Well, insofar as, that element comes in, as I say, to me, it seems like it's more almost a necessary component of the narrator's imagination, and not necessarily belonging, if you will, to the story itself, if that distinction is clear. I mean, so much of what happens up until the very end of the story, it becomes rather grisly, actually. I mean, as the narrator, again, sort of, occasionally encounters Brooksmith in these different, places and different situations, but from the way it's being told, you can just sense, and as I tried to show this in the way in which the pronouns shift around, that he's, withdrawing any real sympathy for Brooksmith. And I mean, that to me is much more in keeping with kind of almost the naturalistic plot rather than an intentionally melodramatic one.
I agree.
Yeah. I mean, if that's really what James wanted to do, the ending certainly could have been different. I mean, they could have found Brooksmith floating in the Thames, or I don't, something just more explicit to emphasize the potential violence of. I mean, just having him walk into the night and I think the metaphor that the narrator uses is that, and here again, it reduces Brooksmith, almost metonymically, that there's no gleam from his white waistcoat, that comes out of the obscurity, out of the doom, out of the gloom, as if the darkness is just sort of swallowed him up. I mean, the Gothicism of all that certainly could have been exaggerated or treated in a different way if the melodrama was what he was really wanting to emphasize, I think.
And I was thinking, they have two more questions. I will refrain from making another my own question. Yes, we have time, I think.
Sure, I do.
Yes. If Cedric refers to the story as James' outrageous gift, does that relate to how you feel about the story? Cedric.
I'm not.
Yes.
I'm not exactly familiar with her comments about the story as an outrageous gift, so I'm not quite sure how to understand it in those terms. I mean, it is true, and at least one other recent critic of the story has tried to suggest that there is a kind of homosocial undercurrent in the tale. I mean, while there's some evidence, I think, intrinsically to confirm that, there are also sort of contrary forms of evidence in the piece, I think, that make that kind of reading a little bit more suspect. I mean, Mr. Offred's salon is not exclusively male, although, of course, the fact that he has no wife is certainly a demonstrated, fact. But at least the one particular reading that I'm thinking of, it was not Sedgwick's, but another a British scholar that I just consulted recently. To me, the interpretation just felt a little bit forced, but partly because of the way it was presented by that other scholar. Can you explain more what you think she meant by outrageous gift?
And where she mentioned that?
Yeah, that's the piece.
Okay. Yes.
That I was referring to. in a rather, I guess, characteristic way, Dennis takes a very long time to get at his subject in that piece, and at least it seemed that way to me, over the place, and that's one of the reasons why I felt that it was not quite as persuasive as it might have been. Provocative, but maybe not totally convincing.
Another question from Gabriel. How can we understand the appeal and influence of Brooksmith for Melville, having in mind his social and historical context in the US by the end of the century?
Well, I certainly wasn't trying to suggest that, Melville was aware of this story. I was just really being kind of hypothetical that, Melville only lived a few more months after Brooksmith was published. And of course, Bartleby had been published decades and decades before, back in the 1850s. But at least as I was reading Brooksmith, even from the first time, I just couldn't get the thought of Bartleby out of my head, because it just seemed to me that in many ways they're both dealing with this kind of social annihilation, in a way, of characters rather helplessly becoming invisible, but perhaps even more so because of the narrative techniques involved in the two stories. With Melville's narrator, it seems to me, performing in a way that's very much analogous to what we find in Brooksmith, framing the tale, trying to present it in a certain way that both tells the story, but also in some sense seeks to excuse him from responsibility for what's happened. That was really the connection that I think is most interesting to dwell upon if one puts the two stories in relation to one another.
And in terms of influence, maybe it would be the other way around. Not that you're saying that, but
yeah. Well, no, again, who knows?
Yes,
as far as I know, James never made any comments.
Yes,
exactly. Again, nobody else did either, because he was almost largely, forgotten, or almost completely forgotten. But it's just, that's why I use the word uncanny when I talked about the. To me, it's the kind of parallels, at least that I can see or feel between them.
Could you explain a little bit? I don't think I got the relation exactly of what you wanted to bring when you mentioned the book. What social classes owe to each other in this particular story?
Well, that text by Sumner was in many ways one of the cornerstone disquisitions on the subject in the late 19th century carrying forward, and his blunt answer to his own question is simply, they owe nothing. And the book was really intended to be, we would certainly interpret it as an arch conservative, almost Spencerian, kind of justification for social Darwinism. And that it was, in fact, a mistake for government, in any way to intervene to try to ameliorate the conditions between social classes. So in that way, it seems to me that, at least if one reads the story from a certain point of view, maybe from the narrator's point of view, he would arrive at the same conclusion.
Yes, exactly. Do we have more questions? I have one question, perhaps before we finish, because when you were describing the end of the story, no more questions. You emphasize this thing about the character disappearing. Yeah, we don't know exactly what happened with him, and that struck me as something that James does a lot in his endings. Like with Isabel Archer, we lose track of the main character, not at the same way. Like in general, there's this lack of the point of view. We can't really go further Maisie as well in
Unless you're
What Makes
John
You,
Banville, right?
yeah.
You know what I mean? And then you can write another novel.
Exactly, yes. And then we have this question. It's not a butler, but we have this very well. That's debatable as well. The fact that Mr. Weeks, her social class, matters to the story, but I think it does, and so it's and all the other maids that are there as well. With Maisie, so it's something maybe that we could talk about a little bit.
Well, as a matter of fact, just the other day, in the letters project that I'm also working on, our team, the one here at Penn State, is actually further along, at least in terms of making transcriptions, than at the home base at Creighton. And so we're now working with letters from the late 1890s, and one that we just did a transcription of, I found really quite wonderful. One of his correspondents had clearly posed certain questions to James about the ending of Maisie and wanting to know, well, what happens next? And his response was, I thought, really, really interesting, because he didn't dodge the question completely, but he tried to make the point that, at least at this stage in his career, in a sense, he hated endings, and felt that, in a sense, that was just another conventional sop, to throw at the reader. And what he wanted was not, in that sense, a story, but the word he kept using in this letter is that he preferred a subject, and therefore, wanted to leave certain things untreated, unspecified, open-ended, rather than trying to, tie up every knot and leave the reader with a conventional sense of, in a sense, satisfaction for knowing how everything turns out, but instead leaving certain doors open for the reader's imagination to ponder, rather than to, in a sense, foreclose other options or possibilities. I mean, Brooksmith, by comparison, I don't think is very open-ended. I think it is pretty. The implication seems really quite clear, that he's gone, and probably has just, again, thrown himself into the river, or whatever the choice he made. But I just found that the response that he made to this one reader of Maisie to be quite interesting in that regard. I'm sorry, all this material is on a different computer. Otherwise, I'd pull up the file. And
yeah, that's very, very interesting. I was going to ask you when we are going to have those letters.
Well, these won't be out for quite some time, because it's a painstaking process to.
Yeah, I know.
But I've been having a lot of fun, of course, working on them, and just finding these kinds of little gems, from time to time, and in letters that I wasn't, familiar with before. But it's a big job.
Yes,
Yeah.
I can imagine. Yeah,
Put it that way.
Yeah, and so so if we don't have any more questions, I would like to thank you again, Michael, so very much for your patience, your as I said, generosity to come here and talk to us.
Well,
And
I'm
do hope next time it's going to be in person.
Well, that would be fun.
Yes. And I would like to thank also the audience for the questions, and also thank a lot, very much, the organizing committee and the leaders of the research group, Professors Natasha and Larissa. And I would say to the audience as well to stay tuned for our next panels and lectures. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the opportunity.